I'm John Evans, and welcome to another episode of One-on-One. Kyle Mills is a New York Times bestselling author who has entertained fans with his thriller novels for more than 25 years now. He wrote 3 books in the Robert Ludlum universe. You know, that's the guy who created the Jason Bourne character. Kyle also wrote 9 books in the Mitch Rapp series, taking over after the tragic death of Vince Flynn. Kyle's 24th thriller is now available for his fans. It's called Fade In, and it proves that in the world of fiction, characters are never really dead. And Kyle joins us from his home in Wyoming. Kyle, it's great to connect with you. Thanks for being on the One-on-One with John Evans podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Why did you decide to bring back your former Navy SEAL character, Salam al-Fayed, who your fans know as Fade?
Yeah, I had written a book about him 20 years ago, and in my mind, he died at the end of it. But then I couldn't stop thinking about him, and I got an enormous amount of mail about him. And one day I figured out a way, just randomly popped into my head, how he could have survived. But that was probably almost 10 years ago, and I wasn't sure what the story was for him. I did the Mitch Rapp books, and in the end, the world changed quite a bit in the last 10 years that I was doing those, and it became a world that I thought was perfect to be seen through Fade's eyes.
This guy is not your ordinary hero here. Now, he has all the skills, but he's kind of a Ron White kind of an attitude towards the world, which keeps things, I think, in the book really light and not tremendously intense. Did you create him that way for a specific reason?
He was based on an old friend of mine a little bit who was a recon Marine who had a really wild sense of humor and was, a practical joker and all these things. A lot of the ops guys are pretty stoic, but this guy was really different. And his dark sense of humor and his sort of philosophical side were always really interesting because of the things he'd seen and done. So Fade was a little bit based on that. And yeah, I like to have... I'm dealing in the new book with a lot of pretty heavy concepts, runaway technology, the rise of the power of the elites, the divisions within the United States, the rise of autocracies. And so I wanted someone who could get dragged into that, but would still have a sense of humor and a philosophical take on it.
You bring some controversial issues into play in the new book, as you were just saying. You got you've got a virus that involves China. You've got a billionaire getting involved where he thinks the government can't handle it properly. So did you ever get concerned that some people might look at it as Kyle Mills' comment on current events at all and forget that it's just fiction?
I mean, what I wanted to do was deal with the threats that we're facing today in a realistic way. And the threats we're seeing today aren't as simple as they were, in the good old days when it was us versus the Soviets or us versus Islamic terrorism. They're, as we were just talking, they're AI. They're this incredible amount of power. You think of billionaires who are unelected people are taking on. You think about Elon Musk, who I wrote this before he got into politics, but the idea that we can't send stuff into space without him. We have a hard time communicating without his satellites. He has an enormous amount of power. And so, and not to mention the people with social media who now control virtually everything we see and we hear. And They know everything about us, everywhere we've ever been, all our friends are, everything we've ever bought. And now they can use AI to target us, knowing everything about us. And they can do that on an individual basis. So those are the things that I wanted to talk about because that's what's happening today. And that's, to me, a great thriller. Talks about, what's happening today and what could be happening next week or next month.
Did you think when you published your first book, Rising Phoenix, back in 1997, that you'd still be doing this nearly 30 years later?
No, I didn't think I'd be doing it after I wrote that book. I wrote that book, for fun because I wanted to do something creative. I'd never been a writer before and I loved reading. And, much to my great surprise, it was published, More surprising, it became a national bestseller. And then I had to write a second one, which I had never planned to do. So, yeah, it's hard to believe that was 20 odd books ago and that I've actually made a career out of this.
How many books did it take you until you were pretty confident that you could do it one after another and make it a full-time career? Because like you said, you wrote one, okay, wrote two, but you got it done. Did it take you 5, 6 books till you thought maybe, okay, I can do this the rest of my life?
Yeah, that was just a real weird path for me because the second one was horrible. I had no ideas. I'd never thought about writing a second book. So all of a sudden I get hit with that. I had no ideas. The publishers and agents and everybody's pushing you and pulling you because now, there's money at stake. And I hated it so much. I sent my agent a fax. It was a fax back then. And said, I never spent the money that they gave me, so can I just give it back? Because I hate this. This is the worst job I ever had. And he got back to me that morning and said, nobody's going to call you. You're not going to just deliver a book on time. And it can be about anything you want. And I did. That became a New York Times bestseller. And after that, it became a little easier, but it probably took 5 books before I was comfortable with the idea that I was a writer, because I'd go to a conference and people would ask me advice on writing and stuff. And I'd think, I am such an imposter. Like, I don't know anything about writing. I just finished writing novels for dummies like 2 years ago, to learn how to write a novel. Right. So don't ask me my advice.
I tell people that I will often go over interviews in my head when I'm at home cutting the grass. Like before this interview, I would go over the questions that I was going to ask you. How am I going to ask Kyle this? How am I going to ask him that? Or washing the car, cutting the grass, stuff like that. How and when do your ideas come up? And do you kind of fester them as you're doing things around the house? Or do you have a pre-planned period that you sit down and take it from, okay, here's where I'm going to start, here's where I'm going to get to?
Yeah, anything, one of the things that how modern society kills creativity is there's no more boredom. And I mean, there's always something interesting to do or look at. So exactly what you're saying, washing the car. For like a lot of people come up with their best ideas in the shower because there's nothing to do in there. And so I'm a huge fan of boredom. And if I'm really stuck, there's a mountain called Shadow Mountain near me, and I have to walk up it until I solve my problem. And hopefully I don't get to the top.
Well, I think maybe cutting the front lawn might be a little easier than walking up a mountain, but we all have our ways of filtering through it. Has it gotten easier or harder now that you're, 24 books in, to come up with something that's new and fresh and that nobody has talked about before?
It has gotten harder because you're definitely at the point where you start to think, you're writing a chapter and you think, or a scene, and you think, have I written that before? You have to go back and look 15 years ago and think, this feels familiar to me. But that's also one of the reasons that I wanted to move on from the Rapp series, which I loved writing, and I had always been a huge fan of that series, is just because I felt like I had finished the arc that I was going to do, and the themes, I had covered all the themes that I wanted to, and I was ready to go in a really different direction. And I almost started down that path, and you can see it in the last couple of Rapp books, that I was maybe heading in the direction that I've gone with Fade In, but it didn't feel right for the series, and I didn't want to impose my own style on Vince's series. It felt wrong. And so this has allowed me to explore a character who's very different has the same skill set as Mitch Rapp, but very different personality, and to explore themes that maybe weren't right for Mitch, who has a very, he's always the master of his own universe, and he isn't very techie or philosophical.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong here, but as I read Fade In, there's a part early in it that I was like, wait, I remember something similar to this when he was, I don't want to give too much away, but he was lying in his bed and all of a sudden some things started happening. And I said, wait a minute, I remember something like this. So I actually went back to the first one and said, okay, and then I got into it. So you even kind of borrow, but then take an earlier exit off some of the ideas that you had in the first one.
Exactly, because I wanted to create a book with Fade In that felt like it's intended to be the beginning of a new series. And so what I didn't want to do is write something that didn't feel like the beginning of a new series. So in the beginning, I needed to explain to you who Fade was, a little bit of his past. And so in a couple of flashbacks, really only two, we see some of the things that happened in the first book 20 years ago, but it certainly would not be necessary to read that first book unless you wanted to just do a deep dive into Fade's history. You know, it would read like a prequel. And that's why I constructed it that way. So you would get up to speed as to who he is, because he's an unusual character, very quickly, and then you can move on with the story.
Yeah, but there are some parts of that whole process that stuck to me that you describe, even down to the finite squeaking of hinges, that stuck with me from the first one, that all of a sudden came back and I said, wait a second. But I really enjoyed it. I like those little flashbacks. I think you did a great job. Jack Carr told me that he lines out an entire outline for a book. He has an outline where he goes, but other authors like Brad Thor, Don Bentley, they told me they sit down and they just kind of goes. What kind of writer are you? Are you an outline guy, or are you a let's see what comes out of my mind today guy?
I'm the king of the outliners, I think. I write outlines that are so ridiculously long that it just really makes no sense. So a normal novel is about 100,000 words, and I'll write a 30,000 word outline. So wow. I don't know why. I've always done it that way. And the funny thing is I don't necessarily even follow it completely, particularly with Fade, because he's such a weird character. He'll go off on a tangent that I didn't foresee when I wrote the outline, and then I have to follow him there and figure out what I'm going to do. But I don't know, that for some reason that just allows me to really understand my characters and my story. And then I don't necessarily have to follow it exactly because it's really gelled in my head.
In doing my research for today, I read that you lived in several parts of the country as a young man, as a boy growing up. Your dad worked for the FBI. How many times did your family move? Virginia and some other different places, correct?
We started in, Salt Lake, then Oregon for quite a while, DC, London, and then I ended up in Baltimore after college. And then now Wyoming, but I split my time between Wyoming and Spain. So in fact, I'm moving in next week back to Spain.
You took the leap into writing after moving to Wyoming because you said you liked rock climbing. That was a pretty adventurous move.
Yeah, I moved from Baltimore to Wyoming to pursue my passion for rock climbing and to a lesser extent skiing. And yeah, I worked for a bank and I climbed and I worked for this bank and I never did anything creative. And I always admired people who could. So it was kind of I was on a quest to do something creative. I was thinking about building furniture, but I'm not very handy and I didn't want to fill up the garage with tools. And my wife actually said, well, you love to read. You should try writing a novel. But honestly, I didn't really think about it that seriously because I'd never done any creative writing. I had an economics degree, but I don't know, the idea kind of stuck with me. And I mean, it was just for fun. I didn't think anybody ever read it.
What was her reaction then? She's the one who pushed you toward that Rising Phoenix book. What was her reaction when all of a sudden, hey, this is pretty good?
Yeah, it was. She liked it, but honestly, she wasn't a thriller reader, so I didn't take it that seriously. I don't think I really took it seriously until my father, who's a huge thriller fan, read it. And he's not a guy that I would say, has a lot of good things to say about me. Typical father, they're always critical.
Yeah.
And he called me and he read it. He said, man, this is a really good thriller. And I'm like, I don't think he's ever told me I'd ever done anything well in my entire life. Maybe I should take this seriously and try to get an agent. which I did. And if anybody's been through that, it's horrible and everybody turns you down. But I finally did get an agent, and yeah, I mean, but what a surprise.
What about Storming Heaven? You talked about how difficult it was. When you started sitting down for that one, was it literally like pulling a molar without any Novocaine to get that story out?
It was awful. There are so many people at that point that want to say and what your book is. And because I felt like a complete imposter, these people are calling me who have been in the business forever. I've been in the business for like, a year.
A cup of coffee, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like, well, really in the business for a few months, but I was writing for a year. And so I was trying to take all of their advice and cram it into one book, and it wasn't working. And so that's when my agent said, like, nobody's going to bother you anymore. But it was still, I remember I just lost a lot of weight and my hands shook all the time and my stomach hurt. And I remember finishing that thing and getting on a plane to Thailand to go climbing. And I spent like a month in Thailand trying to decompress from that whole thing.
What's the time frame on one of Kyle Mills' thrillers? From the time you maybe hit that first key to the time you turn it in and it goes to the publisher? What's the time frame? A year, 18 months?
It takes me about a year. And a lot of people now seem to be able to write more than one book a year, but I can't. For instance, I never wrote one of my own books while I was writing the rap stuff. I focus on that one thing, I focus on it for a year, and then I move on to the next one. But that's been pretty consistent, I think, throughout my career.
You've gotten a couple of pretty cool phone calls in your career. One was to write the Robert Ludlum Covert One series. The other was to take over after Vince Flynn's untimely and tragic death for the rap series. Do you remember maybe where you were when either one of those calls came in, and the immediate thought, was it, oh, great, or was it, oh, great?
Yeah, well, I turned down the Ludlum one because that was really before very many people wrote for, what we're now called legacy books. And I thought, well, that seems like a weird idea. But then I got to thinking about it, and I was a huge fan of Robert Ludlum. I mean, I grew up on those books.
Yeah.
And they wanted me to do something really science oriented, and I'm a huge science geek. So I thought, maybe that'd be fun. I wrote 3 of those books, and honestly, they were super fun to write. Some of my favorite books I've written, because I got to push a little into speculative science, not science fiction, but kind of pushing in that direction. The Vince Flynn stuff, the first call I got was from my wife, because she was at work listening to the radio when she heard that Vince died and called me. And obviously I had known that Vince was ill, but I didn't know he was that ill. And I kind of remember thinking, how tragic that was. I mean, he had a wonderful family, and
yeah,
how young he was. He and I were almost exactly the same age, like a month apart. But I also then remembered thinking selfishly, geez, The Last Man just like kind of petered out. Like it didn't really even end. It was meant to have the rest of the story told. And I hope that, they hire somebody to at least kill off Mitch Rapp in a blaze of glory, or give him a wife and like he decides to go work at Home Depot or whatever, something. Because it would be terrible for this series to end this way.
Right.
And then, I don't know, a few weeks later, somebody called and said, do you want to be that guy? So, yeah, I wasn't sure in the beginning, but I'm glad I said yes. It was a blast.
Was it daunting, though? I imagine, because there's a whole different cadre of fans. I mean, it's the same kind of genre, but a whole different group of fans that you've got to try to do your best to impress. And I imagine that had to be a daunting thought, though.
It was terrifying. And that's almost the reason that I didn't do it. First I told him, look, let me just go. I got on the phone with him and I was like, before we even have this conversation, let me go grab my copy of The Last Man and read it again. Because I've never read one of Vince's books with the idea of writing one. Just wrote them because they were super fun. I liked them.
Right.
So, I had to think about whether I could do it credibly. And at the end, I decided I could, even though we had different styles. But the question of, whether fans wanted it continued, and whether they would accept me as the person that continued it. So I had no idea. And so I remember when the announcement, we were getting ready to do the announcement, and I told my wife, well, get ready for the hate mail. Like, I mean, I was really steeled for that I was taking over, I was usurping it. No one could do it like Vince, let Mitch Rapp die kind of thing. And there was virtually none of that. It was an outpouring of encouragement from his fans, from my fans, and they, but they all were like me. They were like, at least finish Mitch Rapp in some way, but don't just leave him hanging. But almost every email ended with something to the effect of, but don't screw it up, which is not helpful.
Right. And I asked you earlier how long it took you to think you could do this for a career. Did it take you a book or two until you felt like you were, welcomed into that universe, the Mitch Rapp universe?
Not really. So that book took me a long time to write. That one took about 18 months.
Right.
Because I sat down and read all of them in order again and took like 150 pages of notes, because it's a really large universe that goes all the way back to when Mitch was in college.
Yeah.
So I did that. I wrote the book very much with the idea of writing, and I said it flat out, a forgery. The idea that no one would ever read that book and think that Vince didn't write it. In fact, he wrote 3 pages of it. So before he died. So that was the goal. And I think I succeeded. Most people really liked the book. And I feel like everybody was rooting for me anyway. And I was really gratified to see that, with very few exceptions, people loved The Survivor and, felt I did Vince justice. It would have been hard to think that I didn't. And then I wrote the second book, Order to Kill, which is honestly my favorite book that I ever wrote in that series. So,
well, a lot of us out there were pulling for you. And what's the feeling like when that book hits #1? Is there a tingle that you never felt? Is there a pride that you've never felt before? What's that like?
That was kind of crazy, because his editor called me and said, "You're #1." And I said, "Of what?" Because I was like, man, if we could get a top 10 on this thing, that'd be amazing. Like, what a success that would be. And I was absolutely, like, I was speechless. I didn't even know what to say. I think she probably thought I was nuts, because I was just kind of like, okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was so gratifying that many people came out for that book. And, it was really a testament to Vince and how much people loved him and loved that character and wanted to see where that character would go. Because, I mean, it's just like me. I mean, I read that character, and that's a guy I'd known since, I think of these characters being real, right? It's a guy I'd known since college. And, he's that really good, the coolest friend you've got, and you get to see him once a year. And you're always anxious for that book to come out. So that same enthusiasm followed The Survivor. And yeah, people seem to largely really like it. So some people are against the whole idea of it, but you can't do anything about that.
It is a testament, I think, to the fans. And, you're never going to please everybody. I found that out in 47 years of broadcasting. You could do the best story in the world that you think you can do, and there's going to be somebody out there who didn't like the tie you wore that day. There's just so many things you could possibly do. But #1, I imagine that's pretty gratifying in your back pocket, though.
Oh, yeah, it is. And the reader reaction. I just got a ton of mail, great reviews and everything. And people saw how much, I think, effort that I put into that. I mean, I sweated over every sentence thinking, is that a sentence Vince would have written? And I really, I went into that with, if it ain't broke, don't fix it philosophy.
What are the options for Fade? I mean, you got him back now. Fade in, I think, is a really great second book in this arc. But you could really have him almost kind of do anything as far as, in domestic world, international world. Do you have thoughts? Do you have plans where you might take him?
Yeah, I'm almost done with the second book in the series. So, yes. So the character John Lowe, who Fade works for, is this billionaire who has collected a lot of the most powerful, wealthy people in the world together with the idea that trying to convince them that making another $1 billion, if you've already got $250 billion, is not that useful, and that many things that they're doing has the potential to sort of collapse human society, and that's not going to be good for anyone. So can they, in a way, collude to bring a little more stability to the world? The politicians seem to be going a little nuts. You have very destructive people like Vladimir Putin or Hamas causing, a lot of problems in the world. China, you have the United States that's kind of moving away from its leadership role in the world. We've been kind of the anchor that everybody's clung to, the rock that everybody's clung to, and that may be changing. So there's a lot of chaos in the world, and he sees them as a group that could maybe control that or slow things down a little bit. And Fade is kind of the military wing of that, because John Lowe isn't naive enough to think that sometimes you don't have to kill somebody to get, you're going to break some dishes if you want to basically try to control the chaos in the world. So I think there's a lot to explore there. It's crazy how fast the world is changing. When I started started writing it, AI wasn't really a thing. There was a little news on it and some early versions of it that nobody paid attention to. And then now here it is coming out, and AI's taking over the world. And God knows what it'll be when I finish this book and it's published. So these are things that are really interesting, complicated for a thriller novelist, but the things that are really interesting to explore.
How tight is the thriller author community, Kyle? I know you're on panels often with Don Bentley and several of your other fellow authors, but can you read a Don Bentley or a Brad Thor or a Mark Graney novel and enjoy it, or are you too involved with writing to see how they're doing things and almost read too much into it?
No, I definitely can. There are so many great thriller writers out now. The one problem you do have after 25 of these things is I assume it's like how an architect or a construction guy feels when they look at a building, that you can see your mind always goes to the structure of it. You can't help yourself. But there's nothing I love more than immersing myself in a good story. And sometimes it's easier for me to read outside of my genre, because then I don't see all that structure and think, oh, how would I have done that? Or this is where they're going with that, or whatever.
Right. Yeah, I used to watch other newscasts. If I'd be traveling or go home and visit family, I would sit down and say, wow, why did they lead with that story? What are they doing that? Why isn't Weatherford? And it took me so long to get to the point where, okay, let them do what they do. I'm just going to sit back and enjoy it. And I've always wondered if you could read some of those other fellow authors and just enjoy it as a fan.
Yeah, you can, but you're all exactly what you're saying, right? You think, oh, I wouldn't have gone with that angle or something like that. That's always kind of churning at the back of your mind. I think that's probably true of all of us.
There's someone out there in this audience, I know there is, who says they have a great idea for a book. We've already gone over how you got into it, but now 24 books in, almost 30 years of doing this, what is your best advice to somebody who really wants to try to do this for a living?
Yeah, it's changed so much since I got into it. When I got into it, authors were much more people who sat in their basement, churned out a book, sent it to the publisher, and then you were mostly done. If you met fans, it was because you did a 1-week tour. If you communicated with fans, they literally sent you a letter. So now it's much more interactive, which is great. You can interact with fans, you can interact with other authors, either online or in person at conferences. So that would be my advice, is remember that a big part of the marketing of it is going to now be you. So writing the book is only one facet of how you publish a book in this day and age.
Once again, Kyle Mills' new thriller, Fade In, is available right now, his 24th book. It's a really good read to go along on an adventure with the former Navy SEAL Fayed. And he's a fun character to follow along. And we know there are more adventures in the future. Kyle, we appreciate you taking the time today. I know you're busy. Thanks for being on the One-on-One with John Evans podcast.
Thanks for having me.
A big thank you to Kyle Mills for taking time from his busy schedule to join us for this week's podcast interview. Fade In is his 24th book. It's available right now for his fans. And if you'd like to keep up with Kyle's events and all of his news, just go to kylemills.com. Now, before we go, I'd like to ask you a favor. Please follow or subscribe to the One-on-One with John Evans podcast on whatever app you use to listen to your favorite shows. And if you'd like to see a video version of this podcast, just go to my channel on YouTube, John Evans TV. I'm John Evans. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of One-on-One.